true that you cannot outrun a bad diet? Oh, this saying gets bandied around the fitness space in the internet and said with such confidence as though it's just a physiological law. But what does it actually mean? And more importantly, is it true? Because I think this is often aimed at people who think that they can go to the gym, do a pocket of exercise, clock up, say, 300 or 400 calories on the treadmill, eat that back at lunchtime and feel completely neutral and everything is done and dusted. And I know because I have absolutely been that person years ago. And that logic made perfect sense to me. Burn it off in the morning, eat it back at lunchtime, job done. Magnificent. But back then, the only reason that I exercised was in order to manage my weight. I genuinely didn't know any better. I have forgiven my former self. I now know better, and I want to examine why I think this phrase is particularly harmful and should largely be ignored. Whether you like it or not, exercise and nutrition, or diet for want of a better term, are natural allies. And before we even get into this, let's examine what we're talking about when we say a bad diet, because that phrase is doing an awful lot of work. Let me illustrate just how slippery this term is in real life. I once saw a patient. He was brought in by his mum, teenage boy. They came about a simple problem. We had a few minutes left at the end, and she said, "While I'm here, can I just ask you about his eating? Because he's a nightmare and he only eats rubbish." And he looked at her and said, "Mum, you're just going on about the truffle pesto that I wouldn't eat." Okay. And then he looked at me as if to say, "See what I have to live with here?" And then on a separate occasion, I remember seeing this family that were fairly new to the UK from Iraq, and they were despairing because their son would only eat chips, nothing else but chips. And I had to gently bring them around to say, well, he's 10, he's probably not doing the shopping and the cooking. So, same phrase, completely different realities. And in fairness, I look at the snacks my kids eat and think, oh my God, it's really bad compared to what I eat. But then I look at what their friends come out of the co-op in the morning eating and go, get a grip, woman. What am I moaning about? So what are we talking about when people talk about a bad diet? I would say, although this is a lot less catchy, we have nutrient-dense foods and nutritionally empty foods. And yeah, it doesn't roll off the tongue, but really that is what we're talking about with food, aren't we? But if we're going to put something in the middle of this discussion as a bad diet, I would say, let's take the beige buffet. The same beige buffet you will see at many a corporate lunch or NHS meeting or sponsored event. You can gain significant amount of excess body fat eating only nutritionally dense food if you've got no off switch. And equally, you can manage a healthy weight if you only eat a beige buffet and never exercise a day in your life. Now, how society judges those two people externally is probably a conversation for another day. But to illustrate the point, health is a lot more than just one or the other. So that said, if your only goal is to hit a number, then of course living off a diet that's one colour, has a shelf life of 100 years and is drier than Gandhi's flip-flop, then yeah, you can manage that successfully on a beige diet. Energy balance does matter at the end of the day. In order to get the scale moving, if that's your goal, you have to get yourself into a calorie deficit and keep yourself there for as long as you want to keep the scale moving. That part really isn't up for debate. What I would get you to question is, how are you going to feel if that's what you're eating? People who also want to use this phrase to back up an argument will cite marathon runners. I used to work with someone who was training for a marathon, and like a lot of people doing hard things, he talked about it quite a lot. And as he clocked up the miles, he did make reference to how much weight he anticipated he was going to lose during the training. What happened? He didn't lose any weight at all. He did the marathon, but his experience mirrored what the data shows. People training for a marathon tend to remain more or less weight neutral. And there's a really good reason for that. If your body detects a massive spike in energy expenditure, it will respond by ramping up hunger. We are hardwired to survive. And this is what people will cite as meaning you can't outrun a bad diet. It has to come down to what you eat. So people conclude, well, what's the point of exercising then if the scale doesn't move? But hang on a minute. This is completely the wrong question. And I genuinely feel a wave of sadness when people tell me that they hate exercise and they'll only do it as a means to lose weight. Not because it's not effective, but I just feel that that's missing the point entirely. People looking at it that way will say that exercise is pointless unless the scale moves. Or if you are exercising and the scale's not moving, then perhaps you're doing something wrong or not doing enough. And I see this in real life all the time. People then overlook the fact that actually, if they are exercising, they're probably sleeping a bit better. They're recovering better from things, but because their weight isn't doing what they expected it to, they're still interpreting this as a failure. And part of the problem of this is that they've collapsed weight loss and health into the same thing, but they're not, and they overlap. You can improve blood pressure, insulin sensitivity, bone density, strength, confidence, all without seeing any movement on the scale whatsoever. And equally, remember, you can lose weight when you are stressed out, malnourished, and utterly miserable. But hey, the scale's moving. Do you see how wrong that is? So exercise matters enormously, and here's the nuts and bolts of it. When someone commits to losing weight, whether it's 5 pounds or 5 stone, what are they really trying to achieve? They want to feel better. They want to feel healthier. They want to feel better in their skin and live life showing up. And all of that is what they are really chasing. And there is no more reliable way of doing that than through exercise, even a small amount of regular activity. And I will leave weight training on the sidelines for this point, because all activity will do more for your mind than any weight loss tool. People who start to feel better then almost always want to protect that feeling. They sleep better and recover better, and then they pay more attention to what they eat, not from punishment, but from a position of awareness, and they break the sluggish cycle. Your brain is remarkably good at steering you towards the things that you need if you're rested enough and you're paying attention. And there's some really fascinating research to show that people who are deficient in certain nutrients will crave those things until that deficiency is corrected. But if you're stressed out and exhausted and underslept, you're not going to hear those signals. They're going to get lost in the noise. So getting fitter gradually, imperfectly, sets off a cascade of psychological and physiological changes that go far beyond anything you're going to see on a scale or track in an app, because you can't necessarily capture this. But if you're patient and consistent, it almost never fails. Your body was designed to move. We're hardwired to feel better when we move because historically, movement meant survival. So silly slogans like "you can't outrun a bad diet" are, in my mind, completely wrong. It stops people doing the one thing that would almost certainly get them feeling better. I don't think it's a helpful way to think about movement. I actually think you should forget about the diet for now, find a way to move, nourish your body, and let the rest fall into place. Your body is the greatest tool you'll ever own. Reward it with some movement.